Thank you, everybody, and Jeremy Brock, thank you very much. A co-writer of the last King of Scotland. Kevin MacDonald refers to Peter Mogan as the first writer, you as the second writer. So the notion I had initially of you being in a room together is not the case.
No. So the way it actually worked was that Peter had worked on the film for some time. It's an adaptation of a novel by Giles Foden, and for a whole series of reasons, Peter needed to move on, and Andrea Calderwood, who was one of the producers working on the film, approached me, and then I worked on the film for about a year before it went into production. So we weren't actually working together. It was what's sometimes described as a Hollywood rewrite or a Hollywood collaboration. Yeah.
Yes, this is where somebody does a kind of initial draft or initial approach, and then somebody else takes over.
Peter's work was seminal and incredibly important, and it was a genuine collaboration, but we were just never in the room together. So it was a strange experience. But it's not uncommon, actually, particularly in commercial films where there is so much pressure from on top to make sure that the incredibly expensive process of filmmaking is justified by the screenplay.
Yeah. You've spoken about the difference between writing for the theatre and writing for the screen, and it's one of the, I think you see in terms of primarily about the role of the writer, that you're in the cinema, the director's vision is being realised by everybody, including the writer.
Yes, so the relationship between the writer in film and the writer in theatre is complicated. I still believe that the alpha and omega of film is the screenplay. It's the only moment where you have infinite choice. Beyond that moment when the screenplay is finally written and anatomized in production, as it always is when it's scheduled, from that point on, everybody is interpreting a prima facie document. Directors wouldn't like to hear that, and they don't like to hear that, but it is actually the truth. And yes, ultimately the director is the conductor of the orchestra, but I think that that's a more it's a more accurate description of the process. There are many, many people involved in envisioning this, the DOP, the designers, the actors. Everybody is bringing their talent to a process which is conducted by the director, who is the only person there from the beginning to the end. But I don't think of that as a solo work. The way films are marketed these days, it's easier for the public to understand a film as the product of one single vision. But that's not strictly speaking true. And I'm happy to take my place alongside the orchestra of people involved.
Although, obviously, from a writer's point of view, in your view, the screenplay is the foundation.
Well,
nobody will be getting up to it.
Nobody. Yes, I do believe that, and again, I sometimes get into trouble for this, but I believe really strongly that, as in theatre, the script is everything. It's the kind of groundwork from which the tone, pace, character arcs, interaction between characters, and ultimately the structure of the story is embedded. You can do so much in an edit, but you're dealing with finite product, the film in the can, as it were, and it's ultimately what's spoken and remembered. I mean, I was watching it for the first time in many, many years. Lines like Uganda embraces you. Those moments are the moments that hold people's imagination, and they derive from the written word. Yeah.
Yes. Well, the word you used a tiny bit earlier was to do with structure, which I can really understand, and is something that completely obsesses me in music and in film. And one of the things that astonishes me about the work that you and Peter Mogan did was taking this quite sprawling book, which you probably don't even remember now.
I don't remember a thing about the book. So when I was brought on, I was told by my brilliant producer, Andrea Calderwood, to read the book once, put the book down, and then to deal only with Peter Morgan's very brilliant draft of the film and my own take on what it was that Kevin MacDonald, the brilliant director, and Andrea, our producer, felt that the story should be speaking to. So the themes that resonate in this particular film are obviously Garrigan's inadvertent descent into a kind of madness and a kind of evil. And it's very, very important that his decision is felt as arbitrary. And I can remember coming up with the idea of the globe spinning and the finger as a way of indicating as quickly as possible to an audience that he has absolutely no rationale behind this other than escape from the father at home, only to find that he's with another kind of father in Iddy.
I'm the first, the kind of established sense of who he is at the beginning is really so economically done. It's quite brilliant.
So another of the things that's I obsess about, and actually all screenwriters I know obsess about, is how to tell your story in the first 10-15 pages of the screenplay as economically as possible, because it's in those moments that you're establishing character, milieu, the tone and pace of it, the feel of the film is established there, and that was a particularly hard. There's lots of stuff I remember cutting when I was watching it again now. It didn't make it. Like we had a scene with Iddy boxing in the jungle because he was a prize boxer, and for a long time that stayed in the screenplay, and then at the last moment we felt it wasn't necessary, and I don't think it was, but it's funny to watch what's missing.
I'm sure. One of, again, to get back to the book, which thank goodness you got away from, not that it's very engaging, but the Garrigan of the book is not sexually rapacious in the way that you and Morgan created this character to be, and I presume Kevin MacDonald and James McAvoy as well, which gives it a tremendous momentum and him a tremendous character, a kind of priapic.
Yeah, I mean his venality, his priapic sexual energy was a very important element of the post-colonial energy that complicates his relationship with Iddy. So you're aware of this kind of the kind of mirror slowly turning, and of him realizing what he's looking at, and he's looking at his own part in that. The moment in the hotel when he decides to dob in this health minister, and the way that plays out for him, his shame and guilt in that moment, and the sense of entrapment that graduates slowly to the point where when you're watching it, it's quite stifling actually, and that's obviously intentional, and that's again the work of the whole kind of orchestra of talent, brilliantly conducted by Kevin.
But something that Kevin MacDonald specifically credits you with is the bringing together of the Entebbe airport thing and the scene in the duty free, where he meets this terrible punishment.
Yes, so that was a really difficult sequence to get right. So the other thing you obsess about is your endings, because I forget the quote in Adventures in the Screen Trade, but I think he says they'll forgive you anything in the first half an hour, nothing in the last 10 minutes. And getting the rhythms right between this kind of exponential horror of what's happening to him and the potential for escape really landed for me when I knew what the other doctor was going to do and say. So one of the other most important lines in the film is when he says, you are going to escape because you're going to tell the truth. And that's because they'll believe you, and they'll believe you because you're a white man. And we were very aware. I was very aware in writing it that one of the really toxic complications is his own relationship to colour, and the incredibly superficial way that he initially just takes, and of course the woman he meets initially is a sort of the other mirror, the other reflection, and that's a very important moment when he sees her in the back of the bus, and when he flirts with her and she refuses him. Those are very, very important moments, kind of moral stops along the way, if you like. Yeah.
And this ending, this bringing together of Entebbe, this political crisis.
Yes. Which was public domain, of course. Everyone knew that. Yeah.
Yeah, and this purgatory.
Yeah.
That he goes through, this punishment. You bring them together in the most incredibly powerful way.
Well, one of the things that I learned over time when writing anything that's based on real life, is that you are guided by a sort of emotional sat-nav as to what feels right and true, and you're also trying to ensure that the spirit of the moment is true. You're not trying to make a drama documentary, so you're not trying to make everything exactly as it followed in real life, but you are, because you're trying to tell a story as grippingly as you possibly can, but most of all you're trying to find conjunctions and disjunctions between moments in time that feel really telling. And Entebbe and his purgatory, quasi-crucifixion, that felt to me like a really intense and compelling, incredibly dark kind of pottage. Soup.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually one of the things that strikes me watching it several times now is that you'd expect me to say this, but the music becomes incredibly
it's
everywhere.
Incredibly, yeah. So I'm talking to a composer here. I mean, you can see, I know how incredibly important the music is, how incredibly important the found music is, and how incredibly important the score is. If you were to strip that end sequence of the music, it just wouldn't happen. So the music is one of the things that's blending, and I use the analogy of the orchestra consciously, because obviously the music is a huge part of this film in particular, all films, but this film in particular, because without that blend of extant and composed, it simply wouldn't rise to the crescendo it needs to get to. Yeah, it's incredibly important.
Yeah, and it's also very judiciously done, because it's really, there are moments where it's used. I'm speaking of Alex Heffy's score here. This is not germane to the writing at all, but I've started it now. It's used, I think, very skillfully to actually maintain a sense of genre, of political thriller, and it suddenly at the end it turns into something much more ritualistic. And I don't mean by that it's particularly African. I don't mean that at all. I mean it accompanies a ritual, which is his that terrible scene being hoisted like that. And I think that's, you couldn't juxtapose these two things, the release of the hostages and the
purgatory.
You couldn't do it without having the music.
I agree. I think it's the element, the invisible, visible element that makes that a coherent moment, dramatically and emotionally.
But when you write,
well, I write with music a lot.
Oh, do you?
Yeah. But I don't write with. I mean, it's a sort of. It's whatever is finding me at that moment. But it's never got vocals. It's always just composed music, and I do use a lot of film scores to work with, because they help me to drop into the moment, but they also have a binding effect on scene structure, because structure in a story like this, when you've taken it from a novel and then you've worked on a draft written by Peter, and you're then composing your own draft, structure becomes incredibly important, because there's an enormous amount of story to tell in a relatively short space of time. You're trying to tell the top line narrative, which is what actually happens, and then you're trying to tell the story of Garrigan's emotional and psychological journey down to his nadir, and then you're also trying to track this kind of minotaur, this monster that's kind of coming in and out of focus, and revealing himself, gradually to be as dark as we discover him to be. Yeah.
Yes, there's a hell of a lot going on. I suppose I would like to let me ask you about whether doing adaptations, and you've done a fair amount.
I have, yeah.
How that compares as a writing task with writing original scripts, of which you've also done a lot.
So I think when you adapt so there are two kinds of adapting. One is adapting a composed written piece by another imagination, a novel. And then the other is adapting public domain material that's sequential and hasn't been shaped by another imagination. And the discipline is slightly different. So when you're adapting, say, Charlotte Gray or Brideshead Revisited, it's already been through the intellectual control of another mind, and that's shaped the story. And your task then is to try and pay heed to where those really important beats are, capture them in their most telling cinematic equivalent. And in public domain, you've got no structure. Our lived lives are sequential, they're not consequential all the time. We go to the loo, we eat, we get bored. And that doesn't make for a great story. So when I was writing Mrs. Brown, which was public domain and not a novel, I can remember I was relatively early on in my career, and I really struggled to know where the emotional and story tentpoles were. And over time, when you've done a lot of flying hours, you learn a little bit more. Your instinct guides you as to where the story is going to be most gripping, where you're going to get your narrative traction from. And film is notoriously unforgiving of a lack of narrative traction. If you don't have either a character who's compelling us to watch, changing in front of you, or a plot in a political thriller like this, which is racing you forward through event after event, you're not doing your job as a storyteller.
I suppose my immediate comeback to that is that right. So I'm thinking about driving lessons, which
yes.
you wrote out of your own experience
yes.
to a certain extent.
Yes, it's 1 degree of separation. Yes. Sometimes not very far.
Which is a story about a young fellow learning to drive with a
most
major,
unlikely teacher.
Yes, an actress.
Yes.
It was Julie Walters and Rupert Grint.
Yes.
And you directed it.
I did.
As well. I mean, the notion of that as public domain is interesting because it's your life.
Yes. So I learned a really important lesson when I was writing and directing that, which is that directing actually made me it was too physically demanding for me, although I loved doing it. So it's a very physically demanding, it's a sort of military exercise in some respects. But most importantly, I learned that the truth about the writing being the key to everything. And in telling a story that was largely my own, I had to separate myself from it. And you do that when you adapt a novel. You put the novel down, as I did Giles Foden's. And you have to own the material as if it's a fiction, as if it's a story that you're trying to tell. And if you don't do that, I think the danger is that you're too close to the material to be able to judge properly what's going to be the most telling way to dramatize or iterate a given moment. There's a lecture by Paul Schrader, who gave a lecture to BAFTA. I curate these lectures about screenwriting, and his was one of the finest because it was very rude, very blunt, very un-PC. But he just basically stood on the lecture, on the dais, and said, "Look, I know you all want to tell your own stories. I know you're all itching to, but most of them will be incredibly boring. So for God's sake, 1 or 2 degrees of separation away." And I think if I were to tell that story again, I'd probably separate even more.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
And I suppose the other comeback before I open it up would be that arcs of character and narrative propulsion.
Yes.
I can see that they are functions of commercial theatre.
Yes.
Film and theatre.
Yes.
But not necessarily of the independent sector. They may have different views. I'm thinking somebody like Derek Jarman, for example, who makes perfectly good made, God bless him, perfectly good films. But none of those things apply to him.
No, and for every rule there'll be exceptions. And I think that's really the truth. I think, for every Derek Jarman, there will be plenty of other independent filmmakers who, if I were to sit down with them privately, I would say to them, look, think carefully about whether you can afford to be this static or this meditative or this imagistic and simply pay no heed to the rules of storytelling. So yes, you're right that there is a sort of independent sector which can say, you know what, screw all the rules. But I think you have to be Derek Jarman to do that, and most people aren't. And I think that most people need to respect that there are rules about story that can be a bit algorithmic, they can be a bit quasi-scientific, and that's a waste of everybody's time. But I think if I've learned anything over the 40 years I've been doing it, nearly, it's that actually you do need to think about what's changing. So story is about characters in action and characters changing. So when I used to teach, I don't anymore, but I would say, look at the beginning of your film and look at the end of your film and tell me what's changed. Who's changed and how has it changed? Because unless I can see Garrigan at the end, his bruised face and his eyes, very, very different from the same angle on him in the bus at the beginning, unless I can see that, you're not really serving the story in the same way as I think you can. Of course, if you're Derek Jarman, all rules gone.
Yeah, it's things like story and character. It's where on the spectrum of important things a filmmaker.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of story bandwidth, if you like, if I can put it like that. There's a bandwidth, and you can, if you're a genius, plough a very narrow furrow. I'm thinking of Charlie Kaufman, and Charlie Kaufman, rather like Jarman, can, at his best, do anything he wants with structure and anything he wants with character, and he can play with intellectual conceits within film. Adaptation's an example, being John Malkovich as an example, Spotless Mind's an example. All of them have a playfulness and a genius that's unique to him. Again, he gave a lecture for us in 2013, and it became a kind of YouTube sensation because he basically gave a call to arms and said, throw the rule book out the window. And I was like, yeah, okay, great. But most writers, most screenwriters and aspiring screenwriters are going to need to think about the Greek rules of drama to an extent, I think.
Yeah. Very interesting, fascinating. Okay, please, any questions for Jeremy? This is where I can't see because of the light. Yes, thank you. We have a roving mic, and it's going to rove in your direction. And it's on.
Hello.
Hello. Hi.
What would you say is the best and worst thing about screenwriting?
Oh, such a good question. Nobody's ever asked me that. Okay. I'll start with the worst thing, and then I'll go. The worst thing about screenwriting is the amount of material that you make that doesn't get made. So the agony of being, as I am, a cup half full person. So I'm internally optimistic, and I convince myself that everything I'm working on at this moment in time will get made. And I believe you have to, because otherwise you can't throw yourself at the wall every day. But the ratio of work that you develop to work that's made is horrible. So that's the worst thing. And the best thing is that I absolutely love my job. I love writing. I love... I'm very lucky. I have a kind of big garden shed that I go down to, so my commute is about 10 seconds down the garden. And I can honestly say that I've never not wanted to go to work. I've never not wanted to sit down at the desktop or read whatever raw material I'm reading. I love it for a whole host of reasons, but primarily because I have a kind of childlike joy in dropping into other voices and other lives. So I act out my material. My beloved wife sometimes has to hear it, but most of the time I'm alone with those characters, and I feel incredibly blessed and lucky that I get enough work to do a selection of things, theatre and adaptations and original, usually public domain original, but I've just completed an uncommissioned screenplay, which I haven't done for 20 years. So that's the joy of working your imagination and being paid for it.
Oh, thank you.
That's good. Yes, please.
Here you go. Thank you. Thank you for being part of such a fascinating film and for being here.
Thank you.
And I wanted to ask you about rhythm. You mentioned getting the rhythm right of the scenes, and I was wondering how the outcome of the duration of certain scenes if the outcome is roughly how you imagined it when you were writing in terms of the timing, if duration wise, I think.
No, it's a great question. Is the three-dimensional iteration of it the same as I imagined when I was in 2 dimensions in the page? The answer is usually yes, but obviously the part of when I was talking to Gary about the director as the conductor of angles, shot choices, performance, and ultimately the edit, in all those 4 areas of filmmaking, tone, pace, and the feel of it can alter, and then music can again add another kind of dimension of feel. So oddly, I've found that, like, when I was looking at the scene where Idi Amin closes the doors on him and says Uganda embraces you, I can remember writing that scene. I can remember coming up with the idea of nothing comes from nothing, which is to misquote King Lear, and I can remember thinking of Idi as a kind of crazy King Lear in that moment. And actually the scene as it evolved and as it ends up in the film is almost exactly as I imagined it when I was sitting there acting it really badly. And so I come back in my mind to that other truism about filmmaking, which is that you can fuck up a good script, but you cannot make a good film out of a bad one. You just can't do it. And there is a reason why you can't, and it is because that alpha of the screenplay, that 110 to 20 page screenplay, is going to come back to haunt you in the edit. It's just going to come back, and everything you thought you could play with will just not be there unless you thought about it in advance. And all narrative filmmaking is ultimately bound up with that document that you create, co-create, collaborate on. If that answers the question, I hope.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good.
It is interesting in this for me because of the edit. The editing is amazing.
It is incredible.
She's got such command.
She's a brilliant editor.
Yeah.
But also, because Kevin is a documentary filmmaker, I'd forgotten, because it's a long time since I've seen it, he uses an enormous amount of what I would call kind of court footage So there's an enormous amount of just a shot of someone looking, en passant shot of something happening, which he will interrupt the main narrative with to create either energy, forward momentum, or as the film progresses, a sense of doom and fear. And it's incredibly powerful. So his shot, Steven Spielberg calls them hinge shots, where you just cut away, and then by cutting away, it allows you to tighten or loosen up the main scene. But Kevin doesn't use them like that. He uses them more as a documentary maker to give you a sense that you're in a world that's being witnessed by other actors who have no control.
Yeah, you get
no control.
There's cutaways to what it is wearing. A close.
There's an over the shoulder shot of his epaulette, and I'd forgotten all of those, and they're very powerful. I can remember talking to Kevin about how he wanted to imagine this, and so forgive me. There's a Heaven's Gate. Somebody help me out.
Michael Cimino.
No, sorry, I've got the wrong film. Anyway, there was another filmmaker that Kevin, the Thin Blue Line. No, I'm getting it wrong. Anyway, never mind. There was another filmmaker that Kevin used as a kind of template, who shoots nature, and he made an incredible Second World War film. Thank you. Thin Red Line. Where was the blue line? Thank you. Terrence Malick. So Terrence Malick was Kevin's kind of go-to as a filmmaker when he was shooting Last King, and those sequences where you just see an insect or you see So Terrence Malick did that in Thin Red Line. Yeah, Thin Blue Line's actually a book about casualty departments, so that's going right back. Anyway, yeah. It's
to do with this question of rhythm and the rhythms that are established by that kind of thing.
Well, and the editing, of course, has a musicality to it, doesn't it? I mean, in the way that it's thought about by really great editors. And that's where you as a composer have such an incredibly important role to play in overlaying, underscoring, threading through emotion. And I mean, as I said, I use music all the time when I'm working because it allows me to tap into emotion in a way that I can't always do when I'm sitting in the cold, damp shed. It helps me to shift.
Got to get the damp scene too.
Yeah. Yes.
Anybody else? Yes, there's one at the back.
Thank you. I'm interested in the music. And for me, the music's incredibly powerful as well as the visuals, because it is stunningly the countryside, etc. Are there problems with copyright or getting the rights to using music, or what's the way around that?
Gary?
There are sometimes. It's a budgetary question, generally. It's about how much money you have to spend on paying whoever publishes the music. And how much they charge. I know in the case of this film, there was a lot of local talent used to give the film its authenticity, and they filmed in Uganda. There was a lot of local talent. I think you can hear it. It's in, as well as a score by Alex Heffes that uses some of that, and also does his own, has a step away from that. And the copyright thing, the list on the end is not that extensive. I think it wouldn't have cost them an enormous amount of money. But that's the thing, you pay, and if you can't afford to give a few million to the particular artist, then you don't use it in the film. So that's really it. Anyway, any questions for him? But thank you, that was great. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. At what point did you, when you were writing the screenplay, turn Idi Amin from a benefactor to a villain, essentially?
Great question. So I think I mean, looking at the film again, I can see, there are various points along the way where Garrigan senses something isn't going to be quite as he imagined it was. But the moment where you feel that you are in the grip of evil is when the passport is Ugandan. And there's a sense of complete transformation and transportation there to something other. And there are plenty of moments, like the moment in the aerodrome, when he's nearly assassinated, where you think, okay, this is dark, but he's still at the point where he's convincing himself that violence must meet violence. So he's still in that kind of post-colonial trope, which, for his own reasons, for his own solipsistic reasons, is an argument he can cling to. But the moment he realizes he is literally the man's prisoner and that this man is capable of anything, that's when the terror really kind of cuts in. And it's not a surprise that at that point it even makes less of an effort to disguise, although I wanted him still to be that switchback. So I still wanted him to smile right through to the very, very end. And I also wanted so all those moments where he grabs his face, that's all there in that's there. And that's really important because the sense that he's this corrupted father figure makes Garrigan's relationship to him so much more primal and terrifying. It makes it more frightening than if it were simply, a guy witnessing something that's wrong. It's the father-son relationship that makes it so toxic and alarming for us, I think. I found it upsetting watching it now. Yeah, it's quite hard to watch that last 15 minutes.
Yeah, no, it's a tough thing.
And obviously the moments, I don't even like referring to it, but the moment in the hospital, that's real, that happened. Okay, so these moments aren't they're not just they're not just plucked out of nowhere. So there is still an attempt, the film makes an attempt, as does Giles Foden's novel, to blend a fiction with extant public domain material. There are all sorts of stories about Idi Amin, and we chose some. There are others as well.
But it's interesting you bring that particular horrible moment up, because that's another absolutely brilliant adaptation triumph from the book.
Yes.
In the book, it's not Garrigan's child, and Kay hasn't had the affair with Garrigan. And in fact, Garrigan hasn't had an affair with... it doesn't go near the Gillian Anderson character. The doctor's wife, his boss's wife in that medical centre, is a very minor character who disappears very early.
But you see, I can't remember the novel, and it's so long ago. It's nearly 20 years ago that I would have read it. But in order to draw the audience into Garrigan's moral conflict, his engagement with Gillian Anderson's character and then his engagement with Kay is vital from a storytelling point of view.
Sure.
because as the audience you can't look away. He's your traveling companion. He's who you're with. He's taking you through the story, and his lack of any moral center, any kind of it all comes down to that finger on the spinning globe. So once you've got that in your head as a writer, you think, okay, that's the personality. That's how he works, and that governs all his behavior until it's too late. But it's also important that he shows preternatural courage when he's hung up, right? He refuses to scream, and I find it quite emotional talking about that moment, because it's very, very, he has to suffer, right? He has to suffer in order for that character, in our eyes, I think, to have any kind of emotional residue, emotional kind of hold on us as we leave, and as he sits in that film, in that plane. Sorry, yeah. It's really important, that moment. And again, those decisions don't come immediately. You have to kind of arrive at them slowly, and then you go, oh, of course, it's incredibly important that he invites it. So if you look at the shot on over Eddie's shoulder when he says, this is what I'm going to do to you, actually what he's doing is he's nodding, right? Yeah. That's incredibly important. All those little details of how he accepts it are key to how we then experience the moment. Yeah.
Very good. Anybody else? I should be drawing to a close, so I think this will be our last. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello. Hi.
Really brilliant. We watched it years ago. My husband and I went to Uganda, was it in 97? 96.
Yes.
So we wanted to watch it for lots of reasons way back when it was years
actually
ago.
Yeah.
And then obviously we've come back today.
Yeah.
And so we went, amazing. When we were in Uganda, we did one of the big travelling trips that goes all around. So it was proper roughy tufty travel of the old days. And we went to markets, and there were stalls in the marketplaces that had all the witchcraft paraphernalia, which was quite disturbing to see, but as a reality. So I was intrigued to, early on in the film, they say about the 80% who don't do the Western model of medicine. And when was that a real scene? Was that in real life when they hung him up on those meat hooks? Or was that...
Did I make that up? Did I make that up, or was that? I'm pretty sure I made it up, but I don't know if it was in the Giles photo, and I can't remember. It's an awful thing to admit, but what happens is that your kind of connection to the source material and to your own imagination gets very blurred, and so I honestly can't tell you whether someone else had that idea and then I borrowed it and kind of placed it in that bizarre setting, which was obviously terribly important. The kind of off, the kind of off license sort of kind of vibe.
It is a long time ago.
Yeah.
But the reason I asked that was because of him saying, this is what we do in our village to people who do what you did.
Yeah.
So that, because I'd seen those stalls in the market.
Yeah. So I have a feeling, very, very vague, tiny little thread back in my mind, that at some point somewhere somebody said these are the sorts of things that happen. I can remember having a conversation with Andrea, my producer, and I think that this was something that happened, but I can't be sure of that, so I don't want to.
No.
I don't want to give the wrong impression, but certainly the relationship between witchcraft and conventional medicine at that time, that was the ratio, and I know that. I have a nephew who worked in Africa for a long time. I know that witchcraft and that kind of medicine still has its role to play in a lot of people's lives, and that would have been what Garrigan met when he arrived.
Yeah.
I don't think it is in the book.
Right.
I don't think it is. I read it super fast, but I don't think it is.
I have a feeling it probably isn't, because I think by then, particularly near the end of the screenplay, by then I was kind of free-flowing a bit. Yeah.
No wonder it's so powerful. Thank you for that. Thank you for all the questions.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, and thank you, Jeremy Brock.
Thank you for having me.